When a racist waiter refuses to serve an elderly black boy, his act of cruelty sets off a chain of events so shocking it leaves the entire restaurant speechless. But what happens next changes everything. The soft hum of conversation filled the air of Maison Rouge, a high-end restaurant nestled in the heart of the city. Guests dined under glittering chandeliers, their laughter blending with the gentle clinking of cutlery. It was a world where everything appeared pristine, at least on the surface. The double doors swung open, and in walked an elderly black boy, his small frame wrapped in a faded grey sweater. His weathered sneakers scuffed lightly against the polished floor as he shuffled toward an empty table in the corner. His eyes, though kind, carried the weight of years spent navigating a world that wasn't always kind in return. The boy's movements were slow, but deliberate. He pulled out the chair and sat, resting his trembling hands on the edge of the table. He glanced around the room, unsure if he truly belonged in such a grand space, but something inside him pushed him to stay. He just wanted to enjoy a quiet meal, nothing more, nothing less. Across the room, the waiter, Trevor, stood with a tray balanced on his palm, his sharp suit tailored perfectly to his frame. Trevor had always prided himself on his ability to read the clientele, the wealthy businessmen, the elegant socialites. They were his kind of people. But the sight of the elderly boy sitting alone made Trevor pause, a flicker of disdain flashing across his face. He walked briskly to the host stand, where his colleague Jessica greeted him with a warm smile. "Table 6 just sat themselves," she said. Trevor didn't return the smile. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder at the boy and scoffed. "Not for long." Jessica frowned, sensing the tension in his voice. "What do you mean?" Trevor straightened his tie, his voice dripping with arrogance. "This is Maison Rouge, not some corner diner. Look at him. He's probably lost." Before Jessica could respond, Trevor grabbed a menu and marched toward the table. The boy looked up as Trevor approached, his face lighting up with a polite smile. "Good evening, sir," he said softly, his voice gentle and unassuming. "I'd like a menu, please." Trevor didn't sit the menu down. Instead, he hovered above the boy, his expression hard. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked tonight," he said, his tone curt. The boy's smile faltered. He glanced around the room, noticing the empty tables scattered throughout. "But there are seats available." Trevor leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper that was sharp enough to cut. "I don't think this is the place for you. Maybe try somewhere more suitable." The boy's hands tightened slightly on the edge of the table. He blinked, his face blank, as if the words hadn't quite registered. But the murmur of nearby conversation seemed to grow quieter, the eyes of nearby diners beginning to linger. A woman at a nearby table furrowed her brows, leaning toward her husband. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice low. "I don't know," he replied, his fork frozen mid-air. "But it doesn't look right." Jessica, watching from the host stand, felt a knot forming in her chest. She had worked with Trevor for years, but this side of him, a cruel, overt prejudice, was something she couldn't ignore. "Sir," the boy said again, his voice softer now. "I have money. I just want to eat." Trevor scoffed, stepping back and shaking his head, as if the boy's presence was an insult to the very fabric of the restaurant. "I think it's time for you to leave." The restaurant fell silent. All eyes turned toward the small figure sitting at the corner table. The boy's lips quivered, but he held his head high. Slowly, he began to rise, his movements shaky but determined. "I see," the boy said quietly, his voice carrying just enough strength to resonate through the silence. "I suppose this place was never meant for someone like me." Jessica took a step forward, her heart pounding as she debated whether to intervene. But before she could, the doors swung open once more, and a commanding presence entered the room. The boy turned his head slightly, his face softening as recognition dawned in his eyes. Trevor stiffened, clutching the menu in his hand as if it were a shield. The air in the restaurant grew thick with tension, and every diner seemed to hold their breath. This was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The man who had just walked into Maison Rouge was tall, with broad shoulders and a sharp, commanding presence. His tailored suit was immaculate, but it was his expression, a mix of calm authority and quiet intensity. that drew every eye in the room. He scanned the restaurant briefly before locking his gaze on the elderly boy at the corner table. Trevor faltered, instinctively straightening his posture as if trying to salvage what little professionalism he thought he had left. "Good evening, sir," Trevor stammered, attempting to regain control of the situation. But the man didn't respond. Instead, he strode purposefully toward the boy, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. The boy turned toward him, his face breaking into a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Father," the boy said softly. A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. Whispers erupted among the diners. Trevor's face paled as the weight of the word sank in. The man placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, his grip both protective and reassuring. He didn't address Trevor immediately. Instead, he crouched slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and steady. The boy nodded but hesitated. I was told this isn't the place for me," he said quietly, his eyes flickering toward Trevor. The man's jaw tightened. He straightened, his full height casting a shadow over the now visibly nervous waiter. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with a cold edge that sent a chill through the air. Trevor opened his mouth, fumbling for words. I didn't know." "You didn't know what?" the man interrupted, his tone unwavering. He took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. "You didn't know that treating customers with respect is the first rule of hospitality? Or you didn't know who you were speaking to?" Trevor's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the menu. He glanced at Jessica, who looked away, unwilling to offer him any support. The man continued, his voice now commanding the attention of the entire restaurant. "This boy, this young man, is my son. And while you stood here judging him by the color of his skin, you failed to see the dignity and worth he carries with him wherever he goes. You failed to see the human being in front of you." The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking down, others watching with wide eyes. Trevor's lips quivered. I didn't mean to." "Stop," the man said, raising a hand. "Spare me your excuses. Racism doesn't happen by accident. It's a choice, a deliberate act rooted in ignorance and hatred. And tonight, you chose to humiliate my son." The boy looked down, his small hands still resting on the table. The man turned his attention to him, his voice softening. "You don't deserve this, son. No one does." Tears welled up in the boy's eyes, but he blinked them away, nodding silently. The man turned back to Trevor, his expression now unreadable. "What's your name?" Trevor hesitated, his voice barely audible. Trevor, sir." "Well, Trevor," the man said, his tone as sharp as glass. "Do you know who I am?" Trevor shook his head, his fear palpable. "I'm David Carter," the man said, his voice cutting through the tension. "And I own Maison Rouge." The revelation hit Trevor like a bolt of lightning. His knees threatened to buckle under him as the enormity of his mistake became clear. I didn't know," Trevor stammered again, his voice cracking. "That much is obvious," David said coolly. He glanced around the room, addressing not just Trevor, but everyone present. "But ignorance doesn't excuse cruelty, and this establishment, my establishment, will not tolerate it." The diners watched in stunned silence as David turned to Jessica. "Get the manager," he said firmly. Jessica nodded and disappeared into the back, leaving Trevor standing frozen in place. David looked down at his son again, his expression softening once more. "You deserve better than this," he said quietly, "and I promise, you'll never be made to feel unwelcome here again." The boy's voice trembled as he spoke. "Thank you, Father." Trevor's breath hitched as Jessica returned with the manager, a middle-aged man with an uneasy expression. "Mr. Carter," the manager began, "what's going on here?" David fixed him with a steely gaze. "I'll explain everything shortly," he said. "But first, this man," he gestured toward Trevor, "will be dealt with, and I expect it to happen now." The manager nodded hesitantly, turning toward Trevor. "Let's go to the back," he said quietly. Trevor glanced at David one last time, his face a mix of shame and desperation, before following the manager out of the room. David looked around the restaurant, addressing the diners once more. "For anyone who may have been wondering, racism has no place here, or anywhere. If any of you have experienced what my son did tonight, I deeply apologize, and I assure you, it will never happen again." The room erupted into applause. David placed a hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him toward the table. "Now," he said softly, "let's order something to eat." But deep down, David knew this moment wasn't just about dinner. It was about making sure his son understood that his worth wasn't defined by the narrow minds of others. This was far from over. It was just the beginning. Word of the incident at Maison Rouge spread like wildfire. By the next morning, social media was ablaze with posts recounting the events of the previous night. Some patrons had captured fragments of the confrontation on their phones, and those videos quickly gained traction, amassing thousands of views. The hashtags Maison Rouge Incident and Stand Against Racism trended for days. David Carter sat at his desk in his office, his phone vibrating incessantly with messages and calls. Despite the chaos, his focus remained unshaken. He scrolled through the comments under one of the viral posts, his jaw tightening as he read the mixture of outrage and support. "This is disgusting. How does something like this still happen in 2025? One comment read, "Thank you to Mr. Carter for standing up for his son. More people need to take action like this," said another. But others weren't as kind. "Why make such a big deal out of it? It was just a misunderstanding. People are too sensitive these days. The waiter was probably just doing his job." David exhaled deeply, setting the phone down. He knew this wasn't just about his son. It was about something much bigger. The event had become a flashpoint, forcing a conversation about prejudice and accountability that many wanted to avoid. Downstairs in the family room, David's son sat on the couch, his knees pulled up to his chest. He was staring at the television, where a news anchor was recounting the story. The owner of Maison Rouge, David Carter, publicly defended his son after a waiter allegedly refused to serve him based on his race. The incident has sparked national outrage and renewed calls for businesses to address racial bias in their establishments. The boy turned the TV off, his chest tightening. He didn't want to be at the center of attention, but he couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. David walked into the room, noticing his son's uneasy expression. He sat beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. The boy hesitated before responding. "I don't understand, Father. Why do people hate me when they don't even know me?" David's heart ached at the question, his grip on his son's shoulder tightening slightly. "It's not about you," he said firmly. "It's about their ignorance, their refusal to see past their own prejudices. But that doesn't mean their actions don't hurt. And it doesn't mean we stay silent." The boy looked up at him, his eyes brimming with tears. "But what can we do? It feels like nothing ever changes." David leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "We change it by standing up, by calling out injustice when we see it, by showing people that hate doesn't win, not in our family, not in our community, not anywhere." His son nodded slowly, the weight of his father's words sinking in. Later that day, David called an emergency meeting with his management team at Maison Rouge. The staff gathered in the dining area, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Trevor's absence was glaring, and everyone knew why. David stood at the head of the room, his presence commanding but approachable. "What happened last night was unacceptable," he began, his voice echoing through the room. "Not just because it involved my son, but because it exposed a failure in the values we claim to uphold. Jessica shifted in her seat, her expression a mix of guilt and resolve. She raised her hand hesitantly. "Mr. Carter, I wanted to step in last night. I really did. But I froze. And for that, I'm sorry." David nodded, his tone softening. "Thank you, Jessica. It's not easy to stand up in the moment. But part of our job moving forward is to make sure everyone here feels empowered to do the right thing, no matter the circumstances." He paused, scanning the room. "Starting today, we're implementing mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all staff. We'll also be revising our hiring practices to ensure we're bringing in people who share our values. And let me be clear, there will be zero tolerance for any form of discrimination moving forward. If anyone here can't commit to that, this isn't the place for you." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over them. Some nodded in agreement, others exchanged uneasy glances. David continued, his voice firm. "Maison Rouge is more than just a restaurant. It's a reflection of who we are as people, as a community. And if we can't treat every guest with respect and dignity, then we've failed. Not just as professionals, but as human beings." The meeting concluded with a mix of quiet determination and reflective silence. As the staff dispersed, Jessica approached David. "Thank you for saying what needed to be said," she said softly. David nodded. "Thank you for being willing to listen, and for being willing to do better." As he watched her walk away, David felt a glimmer of hope. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. Back at home, David found his son sitting in the backyard, a notebook in his lap. "What are you working on?" he asked, sitting beside him. The boy smiled faintly, holding up the notebook. Inside were sketches of a restaurant, a place with warm lighting, open spaces, and a sign that read, "Everyone welcome." As the evening went on, a woman approached David, her eyes brimming with tears. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "My son experienced something similar a few years ago, and we didn't have anyone to stand up for him. What you did, it means more than you'll ever know." David was momentarily at a loss for words. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saying that. It's a reminder of why we're doing this." The restaurant became a beacon in the community, a place where people came not just to eat, but to connect, to heal, and to grow. Unity wasn't just a name, it was a promise, one that David and his son had made to themselves and to the world. As the evening wound down, David stepped outside to catch a breath of fresh air. His son joined him, the night air cool against their skin. "Do you think we did it, Father?" the boy asked, his voice quiet but hopeful. David looked out at the bustling restaurant, the light spilling onto the street like a warm embrace. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression full of pride. "We've only just begun," he said. And he was right. What started as a single moment of cruelty had blossomed into something far greater, a legacy of compassion, resilience, and unity that would inspire generations to come. David's heart swelled with pride. "That's beautiful," he said. The boy looked up at him, his expression thoughtful. "One day, I want to open a restaurant like this, a place where no one feels like they don't belong." David placed an arm around his son's shoulders, his voice full of quiet resolve. "And I'll do everything I can to help you make that dream a reality." Little did they know, this moment would be the spark for something far greater, a legacy that would inspire change far beyond the walls of Maison Rouge. The days that followed the incident at Maison Rouge were nothing short of transformative. David Carter's decisive actions didn't just ripple through his restaurant, they echoed far beyond its walls. The story was picked up by national news outlets, sparking widespread discussions about racial bias, accountability, and the power of standing up against injustice. For David, the spotlight wasn't what mattered. What mattered was ensuring his son, and anyone who looked like him, would never have to experience what happened that night again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David and his son stood together in the kitchen. The boy was flipping through his sketches, each page brimming with ideas for the restaurant he dreamed of creating. His eyes lit up as he explained his vision, the words tumbling out of him with the kind of passion that only comes from someone who truly believes in what they're saying. "It won't be just about food," the boy said, his voice animated. "It'll be a place where everyone feels seen, where everyone is treated like they belong. No chandeliers, no fancy suits, just good food and good people." David smiled, leaning against the counter. "And what would you call this place?" The boy paused, thinking deeply. "Unity," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. "Because that's what it's about, right? Bringing people together." David's chest tightened with pride. "Unity," he repeated. "I think that's perfect." But the dream of unity wasn't just a fleeting idea. David was determined to help his son bring it to life. Over the next few weeks, he reached out to his network of restaurateurs, designers, and investors, pitching the concept with the same passion his son had shown him. To his surprise, people were eager to be part of it, not just because of the story behind it, but because of the vision it represented. Meanwhile, the changes at Maison Rouge continued to take root. The staff underwent rigorous training sessions, learning how to recognize and combat implicit bias. Trevor's dismissal served as a stark reminder that there were real consequences for prejudice, and it prompted many of the employees to reflect on their own behaviors and beliefs. Jessica, in particular, stepped up as a leader in the restaurant's transformation. She worked closely with David to implement new policies and ensure that every guest who walked through the doors felt welcomed and valued. "It's amazing what can happen when people are willing to change," she told David one afternoon as they reviewed the new training materials. David nodded. "It's not easy, but it's worth it. And it starts with each of us making the choice to do better." Months later, the grand opening of Unity was announced. The small restaurant, nestled in a cozy corner of the city, was a stark contrast to the grandeur of Maison Rouge. Its warm, inviting interior was decorated with local art, and its menu featured dishes inspired by cuisines from around the world. On opening night, the restaurant was packed. People from all walks of life filled the tables, their laughter and conversation blending into a beautiful symphony of connection. At the center of it all was David's son, now more confident than ever, greeting guests with a radiant smile and a firm handshake.